Welcome to this episode of What We Gonna Do, where we're going to talk about this immigration crisis that we are still in. I think that in recent months, it's been really easy to kind of focus on other things. We have a presidential election. We have kind of a racial reckoning. We have a global pandemic that is extremely persistent and devastating to a lot of the country and the planet. But I think this is an issue that is extremely relevant. Not just for us here in California, but for all of us all across the nation. I think that the kind of crisis in some ways has propelled us into this presidency and the dangerous rhetoric that I think accompanied it. So I wanted for us to kind of like take a break to kind of really consider where we are with this, how it's being experienced by the people on the ground, by the advocates who are kind of pushing back on these policies, and how we can kind of create a different system, and why it's really important to be engaged right now with the political situation so that we can actually fight against this. So thank you so much for joining me, Grisel and Lauren. So why don't we give the viewers just a brief introduction to who you are and kind of the advocacy work that you're doing. Let's start with Grisel.
Hi, it's so nice to join you, to Trey and Lauren, even if it's remotely. So my name is Grisel. I'm a supervising attorney at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. We're a nonprofit based in San Francisco. We also have offices in Texas and also DC, but we engage in immigration policy and advocacy and training and education throughout the nation. I personally am on I co-lead our enforcement team, which is basically the team of folks that we have compiled to push back on the disentanglement between local law enforcement and ICE. So think sanctuary policies, things like that. I'm also on our CrimIm team, which means that I sort of dive into the technicalities of the intersection between the criminal system and the immigration system. For example, very few people know, we'll talk about this today during this episode, that even minor offenses in the criminal space can have really drastic, disproportionate consequences in the immigration space. And then finally, I'm also the board chair for Freedom for Immigrants, which is a national nonprofit that advocates to push back on immigration detention. And I'm also an immigrant myself. I was born in Mexico.
Whole gamut. Thank you, Grisel. Lauren?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Lauren Cusitello. I am the legal director at the ABA Immigration Justice Project here on the U.S.-Mexico border in San Diego. But I'm here today with y'all just as Lauren Cusitello, immigration lawyer. I do not speak for the American Bar Association. I'm speaking for myself based on my experiences. And, what I do is I primarily represent folks who are in immigration detention, which is a center run by a private corporation here in Otay Mesa, California. My team tries to get folks out of detention, and also we represent people who are not able to get out and have to do their whole case while they are still confined. And before I did this work, and then part of what brought me to this work is I started working as a public defender 15 years ago, believe it or not. I was a state public defender in Miami, Florida, and then I was a federal public defender both in Sacramento and here in San Diego. And it wasn't until I got to federal court that I had any idea that, we grew up hearing the expression, make a federal case out of it. You think it's about bank robberies and train heists and things like that, but the single most prosecuted crime in federal court is re-entering the United States after you've been removed. It's more than half of criminal prosecutions every year. And so in representing people who were charged with that crime and realizing most of my clients had not been represented by counsel when they were ordered removed from the country in the first place, I became increasingly aware and concerned about the injustice in the immigration system, and that's what brought me to eventually working in removal defense. It's bringing some of that public defense spirit to the defense of removal cases in the immigration system, where people have far fewer rights, do not have the right to appointed counsel, all of those things. And that work, of course, has brought me to activism as well. Before I was here at the ABA, and even now, I participate in local immigrant rights groups. I'm wearing my SDIRC t-shirt today, the San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium. And through that work, Grisel's organization, Freedom for Immigrants, helped us create a bond fund here at the border to pay the bonds of people who have been ordered released from custody but can't afford to get out. And so we sort of mirrored the work that they were doing up there in the Bay and created a fund down here and have seen a movement for the same kind of funds to support immigrants that we've also seen in the bail reform criminal arena for a few years now. And so I'm happy to talk about any of those things and more, but I'm really happy to be here speaking with both of you.
Well, thanks so much for both of you. I'm glad that your organizations are already collaborating. I feel like this is a great relationship to establish. I'm glad to introduce you two more formally. And I also am really interested to talk about this kind of intersection between kind of all this rhetoric around criminal justice reform and immigration reform, because there's a lot of overlap that I think people aren't as consciously aware of as they should be. So very briefly, I feel like in this space, there's a lot of misinformation about what the immigrant kind of situation even is in the US, where they come from, how many people are we talking about, where do they even live, are they criminals or not? And so I think if we could just briefly give people a sense of like, what is the situation, whichever you wants to kind of speak to that.
Do you want to start, Grisel?
Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, I'm just going to start with California, because California really, part of the reason that we are so progressive compared to other communities in our policies related to immigration is because we have the largest immigrant population of any state in the United States. 1 in 4 people who live in the state of California was born outside of the United States, and that's irrespective of whether they have, authorized immigration status or not. And another 1 in 4 residents, there's some overlap there, has at least one parent who was born outside the United States. So, this is a community made by immigrants that has always had a large immigrant population, and most of California was already part of the Republic of Mexico before it became the United States. So especially here in Southern California, there's a shared identity of so many families that goes back generations as being both of the United States and of Mexico. And here in San Diego, we have so many families that are cross-border families where people sometimes legally live on both sides. Sometimes the family is separated by the physical border. But the facts are that in terms of immigration and crime, immigrants overall commit crimes at a lower rate than people who are born in the United States. Communities that support immigrants have lower crime rates. The sanctuary communities actually have lower crime rates than communities that don't have so-called sanctuary policies of not turning their residents over without warrants to immigration officials. So while it is true that people of all immigration statuses do violate the law sometimes, it is not true, other than the criminalization of the act of migration itself, which is a crime that can only be committed if you're not a citizen, that immigrants commit more crimes than people who were born in the United States. It's just not so. The opposite is true. So I'll start there. Our community in San Diego is not just a Mexican United States community either, because we're at the border, the southern land border, and the San Isidro port of entry here in San Diego is the busiest land port of entry in the Western Hemisphere in terms of daily crossings. We see people from all over the world, and San Diego has also been a refugee resettlement city for a long time before policies changed, and we still resettle refugees here, but the numbers have gone down in this administration. So there are San Diegans from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, from Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea. We really, and of course, we have a large population of folks who came in one of the first groups of people kind of recognized as resettled refugees, people from Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos following the Vietnam War. And so, the immigrant population is not just sort of who it's portrayed to be on the news either. It's not just Mexican, it's also not the more recent group of folks arriving at the border over the last 5 to 10 years, Central Americans fleeing gang violence and crime in the Northern Triangle. The immigrants are from all over the world, it's true. And I personally volunteered at a high school here in San Diego where 94 different languages were spoken by the student body. So, I think it's easy to kind of paint immigrants with a particular stereotype or set of brushes and images, but it really is kind of the whole beautiful rainbow of people from all over the world, all cultures, all religions.
And Grisel, would you add anything to that?
Very little. That was excellent. Lauren hit all the big points. I think the only thing I would add is just adding to the tapestry of diversity that we have in the U.S. I was born in Mexico originally. I'm an immigrant. My husband's an immigrant. His family's from India. Very different immigration stories. But the one thing I will add is that especially since we are in this moment where everybody's really thinking critically about racism at a new level, we have Black immigrants as well, which is one of the many reasons why when it comes to demands like defund the police, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, it's so important for immigrant rights groups to show up, not just because it's the moral thing to do, because there's so much intersectionality. And not surprisingly, when it comes to Black immigrants, they do disproportionately receive the brunt of some of the really terrible enforcement actions that we see in terms of who's arrested by ICE, who's detained by ICE, which is really a system of our country's larger mass incarceration system. So that's the only thing I would add is that, highlighting that we do have Black immigrants, that they regrettably do receive a disproportionate sort of brunt of how immigration enforcement happens and the really ugly parts of immigration enforcement by the federal government. And that's really why immigration, like so many other issues, is so tremendously intersectional.
And I think that, that's a good overview of what kind of who are immigrants and what that situation is. I think another thing I'd like to touch on before we go into kind of what we're experiencing now is kind of how we got here. You mentioned ICE, which is what most of us think of in terms of policies and kind of like who is impacting these communities. But ICE is just kind of carrying out the policies that are set by our government. And so I wanted to kind of see if you could give us like a little bit of a history of the policies that have led us to this point. Grisel, if you want to talk about, the 1996 immigration bill, which people think of the crime bill. They don't really think about this bill that really has like ratcheted up all of these problems and kind of abuses that we've seen. And then, Obama, who is, well known for kind of the DACA legislation that kind of, allowed a lot of people to kind of find a pathway to citizenship and to avoid kind of deportation, but also was known as the deporter in chief. So do you care to kind of give us a little bit of context for that as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm so glad that you brought up the 1996 laws because it really puts all of our systems into perspective. This isn't something that came up overnight. This is something, we saw some really, really drastic changes in our immigration laws around 1996. And there have been various campaigns to sort of go back and see what we can do to totally revamp that system. And I'll list some resources at the very end. This is also a great opportunity to talk about intersectionality because you really see what happened in 1996 in immigration laws did feed partially from what was happening in the criminal system. Taking even a bigger step back, it's no surprise that we have such harsh immigration enforcement and such huge reliance on immigration detention, as Lauren was describing, the practice of detaining people for the duration or for some part of their removal proceedings. It's no surprise when we have the largest immigration detention system in the world when the US already has the largest carceral state in the world. The US has about 25% of the incarcerated population in the world, yet we only have 5% of the world's population. So just to give you a signal of how our immigration system really is indicative of some of the problems we have in the criminal system. So I'm going to talk about the 1996 laws. in the context of also the war on drugs. So the war on drugs, as folks may remember, something that was started by Nixon. Reagan really doubled down on it, and it really resulted at the federal and at the state level in a series of misguided drug laws, extreme sentencing that, by the way, also resulted in really, really huge sentencing disparities when it comes to race as well. So within that context, in 1996, we had a series of laws that dramatically changed the landscape in immigration law. We had IRA, and EDPA. I won't go into, those are the acronyms, so we won't go into the long names. But through those laws, we had just some drastic state changes. So for example, we had the start of programs like 287G, which is arguably the worst immigration enforcement program that we have. And we have a lot, by the way. Yes. 287G is a program where local law enforcement are actually deputized to act as ICE agents. Your local cop, your local sheriff can switch off his or her ICE and local law enforcement caps. We also had some big changes in terms of judges having less discretion and really sort of seeing the immigration legal system. And it was already extremely broken, but in many cases, and Lauren, who's in the trenches, can definitely speak to this at a much deeper level. But in a lot of immigration proceedings, it's basically the immigration judge rubber stamping ICE's charges because the judge's hands are actually tied in a series of ways in terms of when they can grant bond, when they can grant immigration relief, et cetera. So, and one of IRA's most draconian features, of which there are many, was really inspired by the war on drugs. So with IRA, after IRA, we got the result that even a simple drug conviction, so we're talking, it could be a simple drug possession, it can be from many years ago, it can be the type of thing that any other person would just get a slap on the wrist on, or maybe now in this moment we're really thinking about legalizing marijuana, and I think it's over 30 states have legalized it to some degree. What we have in the immigration system is if you have a prior possession, that's something that can result in really, really drastic consequences for the immigration case. You have a possession and suddenly you could be permanently barred from ever getting a green card. If you're a green card holder, you can be placed in deportation proceedings. You won't be able to naturalize. You might not be able to get bond. So suddenly all of these barriers come up, even with something minor, even with something that in our criminal system, we might get a slap on the wrist on, or you might even be in a situation where the criminal judge says, oh, this is actually erased, when in reality, it's not erased for your immigration case. So that's just to give you an example of some of the really terrible changes that we saw as a result, and that have really sort of formed the basis of how bad things are right now. And if you're interested in learning more, there are a lot of groups who've been working to fix 96 or go back and try to entirely replace that broken regime. And if you're really interested in getting more information, go to immigrantjusticenetwork.org to get more information about these laws and what you can do to plug in this system. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Oh, yay. Thank you for that overview, Grisel. I was saying, Lauren, if you could maybe speak to kind of how we built upon those draconian new policies that, Obama enforced to a degree, even with something like DACA also kind of trying to make up for some of those abuses, and then kind of leading up to the Trump administration.
Absolutely. So I think in a lot of ways, what we've seen in the immigration area is 100% reflective of what we've seen across this administration, which is that so much of our governmental structure relies on obedience to norms and use of discretion. And we've given the executive branch really broad discretion to govern in a way that the constitutional founders never intended for the most part. The expansion of the executive state to include things like immigration agencies with this level of law enforcement power, I think would have been unimaginable to the people who wrote the Constitution, most of whom were not born in the United States, not even in colonial territory. But So an example of that is, so when we talk about what was changed in the procedures in 1996 and the discretion that judges had and the discretion that individual enforcement officers had, DACA is an example. There of course, was a battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court about whether it was an overstepping of the discretion and authority that the executive had. But that's where that policy came from, was the fact that there is built into the law discretion to enforce or not to enforce, just like any police officer or prosecutor has with criminal laws, and just like the Justice Department has with other civil laws as well. And so just like we've seen the Justice Department step away from enforcement in the civil rights space during this administration, we've seen them move in the direction of enforcement, where the Obama administration made very complicated choices, and I'm sure we're going to talk about some of those in a second, but DACA was a blanket policy to say we want this discretion to be exercised in a clear and equitable and transparent way. And so DACA said, we will not enforce the immigration laws. We will grant a benefit known as deferred action, which is essentially a promise not to prosecute you in the civil sense. We will grant, and then we will grant work authorization, the most controversial part of DACA, to people who meet a certain set of criteria, who come forward and identify themselves and apply. The flip side, what we've seen in this administration is, for example, there are many people, and what we saw in the especially early days of the administration, many people who had been ordered removed by a judge because the laws that were passed in 96 give some people no real option once they have been encountered and placed into some kind of removal proceeding in immigration court. Some people, there's nothing that can happen but removal, an order of removal, and yet what you would see the agency do in its discretion was grant what they call a stay. So each year they would say, you can stay here one more year. You don't have lawful status. We're not promising that this is going to last forever, but often, for example, parents of high needs children who are U.S. citizens or who couldn't get the treatment that they need in the country they would be removed to, or sometimes when the person with the removal order had a serious medical condition, just in an exercise of mercy. Just like a governor or a president can grant a pardon or clemency or commute a sentence, it's the immigration equivalent of that they would exercise discretion to say, yes, it was legal to order you removed, but it's not necessary to execute that order. As long as you don't do anything to show that you're dangerous to the community or that you're disappearing or anything along those lines. And there were people who had been reporting like that for years. And then in the early days of this administration, you saw a lot of those stays either not being removed or being terminated, and people with very short notice being removed from the United States with no recourse because the order had been final for years. And so that's an example of the way in which really the discretion has gone from one end of the spectrum for the most part to the far other end of the spectrum, and that we've created laws that give that room. But like we've seen across so many areas where we're trusting the president or trusting the people the president appoints to enforce the laws or apply the laws in a way that's equitable and merciful and kind and humane, this administration has overwhelmingly failed to do that, and in fact leaned in the direction of enforcing the laws in an inhumane and cruel way with the intention of deterring any kind of migration or seeking of refuge based on the way in which they exercise their discretion.
Well, okay, so now we're kind of venturing in. I mean, we could have overviewed Obama, who I think we can say had a complex view and stance on immigration. But I think that what we are now all very aware of is the types of, beyond just kind of the discretion change, we've seen some policies that are like especially cruel and punitive that this administration has promoted, as a part of why they should stay in power and kind of enact the Republican agenda. And let's go over some of those. Grisel, you might want to speak to it. We know we've seen the child separation. We know about the Muslim ban. I mean, kind of define what this era has really meant in terms of like a change in tone and kind of intended impact.
Yeah, sure. And I think this also really forces us to ask some critical questions about all of our systems. This is actually something I've been reflecting on a lot recently. Who writes our laws, who enforces our laws, and whom are those laws enforced against? Whether we're talking immigration, whether we're talking the criminal system, is that if you took a photo of who is in each of those categories, it's not surprising that it's largely defined by race and class. So I just want to note that, just because I think that there really is so much intersectionality over what's happening in the immigration system and in the criminal system. And so when we're calling for things like, it's not enough to reform the systems, we need to abolish and rebuild, I think that really carries through to immigration as well. So in terms of some of the things that we've seen in the Trump era, and I might focus just on sort of the criminalization and the framing that we've seen, which, by the way, isn't new in terms of the Trump administration. In fact, it is something that we saw even under the Obama administration, when Obama was announcing some changes in the manner in which he was going to enforce immigration law apart or in addition to DACA, so people who weren't covered under DACA. What he announced was that he was going to go against, or the federal government was going to pursue felons and not families. And so
like felons don't have families.
Exactly. That is a critical piece that was totally lost in the narrative, and yet a piece that underlies all of the problems that we've seen. And quite frankly, something that Trump has just doubled down on. ICE actually issues on a regular basis how many people they arrest. And it's just a laundry list of the worst things that they can find out about people so that they can criminalize them as much as possible to justify all of their practices. Because you call someone a criminal in the US, you can do anything to them. They don't deserve a lawyer. They don't deserve due process. Who cares if you separate them from their families? And again, this is something that we see to varying levels in both the criminal and in the immigration system. And so that's, I think, one thing that has been incredibly damaging, this good versus bad immigrant. You're deserving, maybe you might be deserving of justice if you're, the undocumented student who got into Harvard, but what if you're something less than a saint? Are you not deserving of justice? Are you not deserving of dignity? And so exactly, I think you hit the nail on the head, Trey, when you said, well, felons or people with felony convictions also have families. So actually, when we saw, when former President Obama was announcing that change in policy and saying they were only going against felons, not families, just for a few stats, when he spoke those words, more than 2.7 million children in the US had an incarcerated parent. Nationally, there were more than 120,000 incarcerated mothers and 1.1 million incarcerated fathers with minor children. In fact, the issue is so pervasive that Sesame Street actually introduced a new Muppet, Alex, who had a parent in jail. Total aside, I don't have kids, but Sesame Street is incredibly woke. I feel like I might start watching for all of these undertones. But again, the Trump administration has really doubled down on this narrative, and it's really been kind of at the heart of some of the problems, some of the policy decisions that we've seen. So he's really, really drastically attacked what we used to call them community policing policies. Today in the narrative, they're called sanctuary policies. But again, that practice to say, why is our local law enforcement helping ICE? Why is our local law enforcement dedicating local resources to assist this huge, incredibly well-funded federal agency? And so that's actually something that happens in almost every jurisdiction in the US, that our local law enforcement will to some degree help the federal government identify, deport, detain people. That's something that Trump has really doubled down on. That was one of the things that when he came in, he said he was going to go after those jurisdictions. He was going to try to engage more law enforcement to dig deeper and to assist the federal government even more. And that's all been under this narrative of, oh, we need to go after the bad people. We need to go after the felons. again, totally misunderstanding that these do have families, and quite frankly, I think it's you know, if we're really taking a close look at how broken our criminal system is, all of that really carries through into the immigration system as well. All of this feeds into the border crisis as well, or what's sort of what we've seen at the border. But I'll let Lauren talk about some of the individual policies that she's seen.
So I think that Grisel is absolutely right that there, you know, I've been saying for a long time that we've been years deep into a movement that's finally really seeing kind of the fruits of its labor to say, you know, I was lucky enough to take Professor Stevenson's class in law school, but no, you know, nobody should be boiled down to the worst thing they've ever done. But unfortunately, we've added the coda to that nobody should be boiled down to the worst thing they've ever done if they were born in the United States, because, and I mean, which is not even to say that possession of methamphetamine is necessarily even the worst thing that somebody's ever done, but it can literally, you know, end that person's life and end their family's life as a unit in this country if they are not a permanent resident or don't have authorized status. There is no legal way to immigrate with a drug conviction. And that, I mean, that's where, when we go back to, you know, 96, I don't think if we were to pass even some version of those laws today that we would treat drugs as harshly as we did then, because I think we've made a lot of progress in recognizing that drug abuse is a public health problem and that it's often a symptom of the lack of mental health resources that we have in our community. And also, culturally, the United States is not that much better than other cultures, but certainly a lot of the cultures that the people we work with come from, you know, seeking mental health treatment is not considered sort of acceptable, especially if you're a provider or the breadwinner in your family, to admit that you're living with depression or living with another mental illness. And so many people do turn to occasional drug or alcohol use to sort of self-medicate, including when there are no resources available or no affordable resources. And so I think, especially with drugs, the draconian consequences that we place on even misdemeanor, minor drug offenses in terms of complete loss of status and loss of really any waivers or alternatives for so many people with those kind of histories is something that really, if most people knew about it and heard the stories of the people affected, I think there would be a movement to reconsider that, first of all. But then, yeah, when you look at what's happening at the border, the concept of asylum, what it means to seek asylum in this country is so misunderstood, certainly, but just not understood at all. I think certainly the idea that it would have been better had we granted something like asylum to people who were persecuted and murdered and victimized by the genocide during World War II, and understanding that's what led to the treaties, the beginning of the international conversation that led to the laws we have now. But different countries implement those treaties and those laws in very different ways. And in the United States, unlike Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, we have no category of visa or permit or temporary permission to be present in the United States that's based on the fact that you are afraid. If you come to the border of the United States and you have your passport from, Myanmar or Chechnya or Sudan or a country where, there's clearly persecution going on, or a region where there's persecution going on. You come and you say, I'm here because I have suffered persecution, I had to flee, and you don't have a visa to enter the United States. The law is that it is mandatory for the United States government to detain you in a jail. They'll call it detention, but it's the same jail where people facing criminal charges are incarcerated, that you are not eligible for bond, and that if you are released at some point, you will not be eligible to work inside the United States while you're trying to convince a judge to grant you that status until you've been waiting for 6 months. So for 6 months after you're released, generally, for 6 months, you have to find some way to sustain yourself or rely on the kindness of the community or supporters while you are here fleeing for your safety and the safety of your family. And I don't think most people know that's the situation we were dealing with even before the policies we've seen put into place over the last few years. And so what we've seen before the pandemic was an attempt to ban requests for asylum by people who didn't knock on the door at the port of entry. Now, what happens if you knock on the door is what I just said. First they hold you in the Border Patrol station. It's not supposed to be longer than 48 hours, but regularly people are held for 5, 6, 7 days before they're transferred anywhere else. And they're regularly held in what most of our clients refer to as hieleras, which translates to ice boxes, because it's so cold. So many people are held in the same space. We hear stories of people literally having frozen burritos sort of tossed into the room like they're animals in a cage. I think we've all seen photos of the, foil blankets that are, emergency blankets, essentially, because it's constantly treated like this is something that Border Patrol doesn't expect to have to deal with on a regular basis. And so many people don't want to put themselves or their children in that situation and go around. And also many people who are attempting to come here and seek protection, have to rely on smugglers because the violence and crime along the journey is very dangerous. And most people don't know the way. People who are not from the region have no reason to know how to get to the border. And so the first thing this administration tried to do is say, if you didn't go and wait at the port of entry and ask an immigration officer there to put you in jail and make you wait for a judge and make you wait for an interview to even determine whether we believe that your fear is real enough that you get to see a judge. People who made the choice not to put themselves in that situation, that they wouldn't be allowed to apply for asylum at all, that they would be automatically denied. Even though the law says a person who is present in the United States without any regard for how they arrived in the United States is eligible to apply for asylum. The administration tried to issue an executive order basically contradicting the law passed by Congress. And that first attempt has been shut down so far. The second attempt was to say that people who went through a third country that was not the country that they have fled and did not seek asylum in that third country first and can't explain why, that those people are not eligible for asylum. And another thing that is happening now is that they are attempting to completely change the process by which people who present themselves in the border region seeking asylum are sort of sorted, for lack of a better term, into people who are eligible to move forward in the process and people who aren't. Right now, it's required that people who are encountered by immigration authorities either directly at the port of entry or somewhere in the border region when they're still determined to be kind of in the arriving stage, those people are entitled to what is called a credible fear interview, which is when an asylum officer interviews the person about why they fled their country and why they fear violence or threats of violence if they're returned to that country. And then that officer doesn't decide you get asylum or you don't. The officer just says you have a credible enough claim in that I understand your story, and if your story is true and you can corroborate it, that it would qualify you potentially for asylum, that you should be able to present this to an immigration judge. The administration has proposed essentially allowing the agency to decide what that process looks like. The agency has set up this process for years now. It's looked like this. And what they want to do, we don't know exactly, but what most people predict is that process would all happen in a border patrol station or in the port of entry holding cells, or even on the other side of the border for people that are apprehended along the border, that just like we're making people wait in Mexico to come to court right now, that we would set up tents or camps or things like that along the border and hold people there and do that whole process there not with trained asylum officers who research conditions in the various countries that people regularly flee, but border patrol officers who require nothing more than that law enforcement training that they get at the beginning of their career. And other than that, their training is all law enforcement related. They don't receive the robust training in human rights law and asylum law and the conditions in various countries around the world that people whose role is to be an asylum officer get. They want to take those folks out of the process. And so regardless of what you think about people entering illegally, there is no legal way to enter if the only reason you are coming here is because you are fleeing for your life. There's no legal way to do that on emergency notice. You can ask for the agency to exercise its discretion and allow you to enter, but there is no permit you can apply for. You can apply for a tourist visa, and it will probably be denied.
What's really like characterizing all of this for me, and I think what's characterized a lot of the protests that we've seen recently, is just like our system seems designed to prey upon the absolute most vulnerable people that we encounter, and that we criminalize them, that we don't even give them the rights that we say they have. And I think that we're just going to see more of that should this administration, continue to be in power, not to mention how absolutely demoralizing this is for you guys on the ground who are actually like encountering these families or, trying to fight against these policies. I mean, I can't imagine how, getting up every day, understanding what you're up against, or kind of getting up every day in a detention cell, having no idea what's going to happen to you, affects someone, and the long-term effects of these policies, I think we have only begun to kind of scratch the surface of. So, I know that we have limited time. So I think that what I'd like to talk about now, if we can, is like, what are we doing to change this situation? I think what we've outlined is obviously an incredibly inhumane process that can't be allowed to persist any longer than absolutely necessary. So, Grisel, maybe you can kind of start us off with like what is being done to kind of counteract all of this.
Yeah, of course. So as we've been discussing federal immigration law, a lot of when we talk about immigration law, we are talking about federal laws, and so there is a tremendous amount of work being done to think through how we might be able to change these laws at the federal level. However, there's still a tremendous amount that can be done at the state and local level, because as we've discussed, it turns out that our local agencies actually play a tremendous role in propping up and supporting the federal government's detention and removal system. And so there is a lot of advocacy that has been done at the local and state level. And so in California, for example, and I'll focus on California just because that's where I'm based, but there is a lot of really exciting work happening in other states like Washington, New Mexico, et cetera. But in California, one thing that we've done is pass a series of laws and policies at the state and at the local level to pull our local governments out of these unnecessary methods of cooperation. And so at the state level, for example, we've passed a series of laws on immigration detention to, again, pull our state back from supporting that system, and also to insert some oversight of the system at the state level. At the local level, and also at the state level, we've also passed a series of sanctuary policies where, again, we ensure that our local law enforcement isn't assisting the federal government unnecessarily. So those are some of the things that we've done just to provide a little bit of backdrop. And that's actually just sort of a hint at what we've done. We've also done things like actually make changes in the criminal code to ensure that we have fewer of these disproportionate impacts, i.e. someone gets a minor or even more serious criminal offense, but then it has these huge, drastically disproportionate consequences in the immigration case. So we've actually also made tweaks in the criminal system to lessen or mitigate some of that impact. But the one thing I'll focus on for the moment is some of the local fights that have happened to push back on immigration detention. And I think it's important to focus on all of those because one thing that I think people are rightly so really being conscious of is ensuring that this movement is led by impact. Led by the individuals who themselves have been incarcerated or have family members who have been incarcerated or have been impacted very directly by this immigration system in some way. And so in the city of McFarland, which is a small city in Southern California, in a more remote area, the community there has been organizing to stop 2 new immigration detention centers from being added. And as Lauren described, we always say immigration detention in the field, but these are jails. These feel, they smell, they look, they are jails in every sense of the word. And so there what's happening is that GEO, which is the largest prison corporation in the nation, and as an aside,
they are the worst.
They are the worst.
They are the worst.
Private prisons play a tremendous role in the immigration system, but I do want to just note that all of these cages are problematic, whether GEO runs them, whether it's the feds running them, they're all problematic, they're all unnecessary. But here in the city of McFarland, basically GEO has been, it really feels like they're sort of orchestrating the addition of these 2 new detention centers with the city of McFarland. We passed, the ILRC co-sponsored and passed a law along with Freedom for Immigrants and along with a series of other organizations in the statewide coalition called the California Dignity Not Detention Coalition, passed a law called SB 29, the Dignity Not Detention Act, which basically said that, among other things, if a city is going to consider this type of permit, they need to do it in a way that provides some process whereby the community actually has an opportunity to be part of this decision-making process, that they have noticed that this is going to happen, that they have an opportunity to attend hearings, and that there are a series of hearings to ensure that the community is part of this process. And civic engagement is obviously so important, especially on the eve of an election. And so basically what happened in January is the community got notice that the city was considering these 2 new detention centers. And that was sort of the start of a 6-month battle where the community was churning out by the hundreds. And this is actually significant because McFarland is actually a fairly small town. In terms of who was churning out, it was farm workers. It was essential workers who were out in the fields, in the fires, playing a crucial role in putting food on all of our table. And they were all coming out at every single hearing, telling the city council loud and clear, we don't want these facilities. This is not what's right for our community. This is not what we want. In fact, we'll consider going elsewhere. This is not what's right for our community. And when you think about elected officials, isn't their job to do what's best for their community? Isn't their job to represent what their community wants? And unfortunately, so here what happened is at the Planning Commission, which was the first stage of where this was being considered, the community actually won. Which was just a tremendous like David and Goliath type battle, because you can only imagine how many resources someone like GEO might be dumping into this fight, because these 2 jails mean big money for them. For the community, though, the stakes are even higher because it's not about money. It's about human life. It's about their brothers and sisters. It's about their community. And so they actually won at the Planning Commission level. After that, the issue was appealed up to the city council, and at the city council level, GEO actually, during the public record, actually said, we will pay $1,000 scholarships to all their seniors here if we get a unanimous vote in support. And that's something that they said blatantly on record. So regrettably, the city council did approve to proceed with the permits. Shortly after that, they approved the permits. Our organization actually sued the city of McFarland, along with Freedom for Immigrants, to basically say that these permits were approved in violation of state law, with an effort to vacate those permits. So there's a tremendous amount of action that's still happening with that case, and there's another case that the ACLU filed alleging other violations of other state laws. So there's a lot of activity and still a tremendous amount of organizing. I think that's going to be a fight to watch. And then the one thing I will mention, and actually part of the reason I kind of need to scurry off is I have a relevant call on another city. So in the city of Adelanto, which is another city that's close by, Adelanto is actually the home to the largest detention center in the state, one of the largest in the nation. And they are also considering the addition of a new immigration jail, also with GEO. And so they actually have their final city council vote happening tomorrow, Wednesday in the evening. So especially for folks in the high desert in that area, Trey, I will send you that call to action. If folks can reach out to the city council members there and tell them loud and clear that this isn't something that's right for their community. But all that to say, there are policy changes and efforts happening at all the different stages. But I think one of the things that has inspired me most in this movement, despite how depressing it could be sometimes, is just the power of the community, and the power of immigrants.
Well, thank you so much, Grisel. And if you have to scurry off, we really appreciate you being here. I mean, keep fighting the good fight, and we'll definitely share some more information about those calls to action. It is amazing when there are victories, because you know how much money and political power is behind these detention centers and how corrupt our government is, that they're very susceptible to the types of lobbying efforts that these organizations employ. So I think it is important to kind of highlight the bright spots and the opportunity for community-based change. And so Lauren, anything you'd add to there? Bye, Grisel. Thank you so much. I think the kind of understanding what's at stake before we kind of go into any more calls to action, what does it look like if this administration kind of continues for more years? What type of impact might that have? I mean, I hate to traumatize all of us by, thinking about that possibility, but I just want to understand what would happen to the extent we can.
Yeah. It really depends on the perspective from which you ask the question. If you're asking the question from the perspective of, Central Americans fleeing violence, who are the people for whom the door has been shut most dramatically and cruelly, people will die or be tortured or be persecuted. And it comes up regularly in our work, in the sort of advocacy and outreach and messaging part of our work, that it is worth remembering that our country tells ourselves stories about ourselves and our history, and often tries to forget the stories that we don't want to tell. But this is a country that denied a visa to Anne Frank. This is a country that turned a ship of refugees around during World War II. And the laws we have now are in part to atone for that. And so we have already, there are plenty of things that have happened over the last few years that we will be atoning for. But if this continues for 4 more years, I expect more cruelty and more tragedy that would be preventable. The source of hope that I have is that other countries might recognize that the United States is no longer a safe place for refugees to seek refuge, for people, we call it asylum seeking if you come on your own rather than being resettled by an agency. But we distinguish when we talk about folks between people seeking asylum or people who are refugees and people who are immigrating by choice. certainly fewer people are immigrating by choice to the United States because we have created this invisible wall of regulations and increased fees and delays in processing applications, not to mention just the cultural and rhetorical hostility that foreign-born people in this country are experiencing, especially if they are not from Western European nations, or if they are from those nations but their skin color belies their origin. And so looking at it from the perspective of business owners or universities or the regents of the board of the University of California, who have been participants in almost every lawsuit related to these policies, because they recognize that we will lose the diversity of experience and perspective and ideas and ingenuity and everything that comes with legal immigration if we restrict what legal immigration looks like. We will separate families by force. There was a lot of attention paid to the separation of families at the border, which was a true tragedy and humanitarian, just wrong. But it was telling that then Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen said that it's inherent in law enforcement that, we never arrest the child with the parent, and sheriffs and local law enforcement officials were saying it's inherent in law enforcement that families be separated, at least temporarily. But removal is a permanent separation. The only alternative is for the person to commit the federal crime of returning to the United States. And so if we continue in this direction, we will see families with citizen children who have never known any other country separated from their parents who are removed to someplace else. And I know this sounds hyperbolic, but we will have lost something of who we are if we don't. I'm proud of our community and the international community for recognizing, once people became aware of the inhumane family separation crisis at the border, that was not who we wanted to be. And many in our community of organizers and activists say, well, there are ways in which that is who we have been. And of course, this country was built on many different versions of that same wrong, generations worth of versions of that wrong. But we are trying to do better, that we should always be trying to do better. And the fact that it has been done and was done so many times before is not a reason why we should allow these things to continue to happen. And when we have made progress, and when we see people being successful, and we see people with more obvious immigrant backgrounds leading, becoming elected officials, when we see refugees elected to Congress from African countries, and we should recognize that if we don't say no to these things in one way or the other, I'm not saying that we will lose our identity on November 3rd if things don't go a particular way. But if we don't start speaking out about these issues the way that people are in the street talking about other, violence by law enforcement, that's a conversation. This is not the first time we've been having it, but it's long overdue to be having it again. And, I think that's the impact of entrenching the direction we've been going is really, I think there's a way in which I don't know that we can ever regain moral legitimacy as a defender of human rights if we keep embracing policies like these or tolerating policies like these. You know, Canada recently removed the United States from its list of safe third countries to which people seeking asylum could be relocated instead of Canada, because they have determined that our policies are not fair and equitable and humane toward people seeking refuge. And that's our next door neighbor. You know, that's one of our closest allies. And so when we try to have power and legitimacy around the world and use the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of who we are, use the Lady Justice as a symbol of who we are, while continuing in this direction, I think the impact of that is something that regardless of what your specific policy views are on different aspects of immigration, just take a step back and look at what this says about the kind of people that we are and our willingness to give a hand to people who need it, who are desperate, and also to embrace people who have something new to offer to us. That should be who we are. That is the identity we were all taught as children. And and even to the extent that there's always been a lie underneath that's our responsibility, is to make that better, to try to minimize the lie, maximize the truth of the dream that we all got taught in school.
Right. It's like, you know, the credibility that we may still have, however, you know, kind of ill-gotten or kind of undeserved it may be. I think that, you know, what we've been describing here and like what a lot of episodes have been dealing with is just kind of like treating people with human dignity. You know, whether you're an immigrant or you're trans or you're Black or you're, you know, even a criminal. You know, I think that people deserve to be recognized as human beings, and I think our policies need to reflect that. And I don't care if your issues around kind of women's, you know, reproductive health or immigrant rights or the LGBT communities, you know, fight to kind of attain equality and escape violence. Like, these are all connected issues. It's just people's like lack of willingness to treat one another with the respect that we would want to be treated with, and the policies that we end up having reflect people's unwillingness to do that. So I really do think that like this whole reckoning is like the giant reckoning of all of this. It's like, are we people who care about that? Are we a country that's willing to admit our shortcomings in the past and our shortcomings in the present in order to develop a new way forward? And I think you said it extremely spot on, like entrenching this direction, I kind of damns us to a future where that is never again who we are. If we ever were, it definitely will not be that way in the future. And so I think that should scare people of all political persuasions, because all of us want to believe that we live in a country that stands for something of value, that stands for something aspirational, and that, you know, kind of gives people from around the world who are as talented as you could possibly be a platform to exchange and develop and kind of fully realize their ideas and ambitions. And like, that's how we've gotten away with all this, is that if no matter where you're born, if you're like, I have something special and there's only one place in the world to go make sure that I maximize the potential of that, it's America. And that's why we've been able to get away with so many of these injustices, is because we were still able to credibly present that as an option for people. And I feel like we've undermined that substantially in recent years. And I think that like we have a lot of road to cover if we're to ever kind of convince people again that that's something that we offer. And I think that is something that's really special. The fact that we have so many immigrants here, unlike every other country, there's people from everywhere here. And if we start to say that is what we want, then the promise of this nation is done for. So with that all being said, how can we get involved in the fights that you're involved with, Lauren, and kind of any specific calls to action that you'd like to tell us about before we conclude? This has been really, really wonderful, and I really appreciate you kind of sharing your expertise and your feelings from Lauren, but built upon, you know, many, many years of service and activism and kind of experience with this on the front lines. It's been very valuable.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to have this conversation with anyone who wants to know more about it. I think there's a few different levels on which people can get involved. Some less direct and more personal, and some more political. And so I'll give you options kind of at every end. So starting with the more personal and kind of one's own life. So first of all, this is an area where there is of course, there's always a tie into capitalism. So you can look at your personal investments or retirement funds or things like that and find out if you are invested in private detention companies. And just as there has been a movement to divest from those companies for the purposes of ending mass criminal incarceration, as Grisel said so correctly, there really is no separation. The detention center where most of our clients live during their cases is actually funded by a contract with the U.S. Marshals to hold people in federal criminal custody, and the ICE portion of the contract is just a rider on the criminal contract. So it's built to be a criminal jail. And many of these agreements are just with county jails to lease out county jail space for people in immigration custody. But when that's happening for profit, ask yourself, do I want my retirement or my wealth to be funded on the backs of these people who are being held in these cages? Do I want my financial interest to be at odds with what I think is right? And so I think in general, one should try to divest oneself from the incarceration industry. But it's a personal choice. It depends on one's attitudes towards divestment. That's one thing one could do that's a concrete action. I also think it's valuable for those who are interested in this kind of thing. If your family has an immigration or asylum seeking story of your own that you have any kind of access to, I think it's valuable to learn from the experiences of your own family. What brought your family here, and maybe even what were the policies like? People who did have a relative come through Ellis Island can look at the Ellis Island logs. Certainly, I know many people whose story was a kidnapping and enslavement story. It can be very painful to visit that story, but even that, I think, has the same kind of value, that your family's journey in whatever form it took to arrive in this country, sort of being informed about that and considering it, I think will aid you toward having empathy for people who are making journeys that are either similar or not. At this moment in time, maybe motivated by some of the same factors for a lot of people. Those are sort of personal things one can do. I think there are also certainly a lot of great immigrant and refugee voices in media and culture that one can follow. I can provide a list. I don't want to leave anybody out, but I think there's a lot of great things going on in journalism right now around this issue, and especially, as Grisel said, voices of people who are personally impacted or have experienced these things, people who have immigrated lawfully and want to share those stories of treatment and bureaucracy and all of those things, people who came seeking asylum, every flavor of story of arrival in this country from another is out there. And again, I think just informing oneself about the personal stories is such an important part of really understanding this is not just a policy issue. There is almost no policy issue that's just a policy issue. It always boils down to impacts on people. And
right, just to touch upon that, I think that's really at the heart of this. It's like you read these statistics, you read the kind of like metadata about what's happening, but these are people. These are people's lives. These are people's fears and hopes and dreams and families. And I think that everything we can do to kind of tie the statistic to the person is very, very powerful. I mean, you see this with COVID all the time. It's like these numbers of COVID deaths are so overwhelming, but they're numbers. But like when you actually start digging into the people and the impacts and all that, that's when you understand like the true devastation that it's wrought. And this is the same exact thing with our policies around immigration. So just wanted to kind of put that in there.
Yeah, and just like there are personal things to do that are surround race and gender and sex, just you can buy Black and buy immigrant at the same time. That's often true, especially if you live here in Southern California or in Florida or in New York. There's a lot of, Black-owned, immigrant-owned businesses that one can support. Immigrants start businesses at a much higher rate than U.S.-born people do. Because it takes a certain kind of initiative to make that kind of journey and sacrifice and take that risk to go live in a different country. And that correlates to a lot of other character strengths. But then on the policy level, there's the local, right? I think Grisel touched on a lot of that, but here in Southern California, for example, and this is happening all over the country, but a number of our local communities have been motivated by activists and organizers in the immigrant rights community to adopt welcoming cities proclamation saying, the city of San Diego is welcomes immigrants, welcomes people from all over the world as residents of this community, as members of this community, that citizenship has levels. There's technical federal citizenship, then there's just cultural citizenship in a country, and then there's the citizenship we live most regularly, which is living in your neighborhood or your city or your state, and the people that you see every day. You don't know unless someone tells you when you go to the bakery or go to the coffee shop who's serving you that was born in the U.S. or who came here with asylum. And when you do learn, you remember, and recognize that person who I have this sort of daily connection with, even if it's just the kind of smile and all of that, that's what makes a community. And so having communities recognize we embrace the strength of the diverse population of people who live here, and we want people to feel welcome to come here. That's a very easy thing in terms of it doesn't cost any money to issue that kind of proclamation. It does not require any commitment of resources or policies. It's just a statement of values. And then Los Angeles has, and San Diego has now adopted as well, an Office of Immigrant Affairs to welcome new immigrants into the city, recognizing that if you're coming not just to the United States, but to any particular community and trying to figure out how to get a driver's license or where you can park and where you can't park, or all those different things that come with living in a new place. They're even harder if you're not familiar with them from some other city in the country. And then when it comes to politics, I'll start local, which is, we talked a lot about there's only so much that cities and counties can do in the world of immigration policy. But You've heard this in other realms, but it's also true. Ask your candidates for local prosecutors, whether that's district attorney or city attorney is what we call it here in San Diego, what most of the California jurisdictions call it. So the city attorney is the person who prosecutes low-level offenses, misdemeanors, and infractions. But just because it's not a felony doesn't mean it can't have serious immigration consequences. And so asking those people, do you have a policy about how you negotiate cases when the person accused of the crime is not a citizen of the United States? Do you take that into consideration? Do you consider alternatives to the deportable crime and when you're resolving cases? And really organize around candidates who are thoughtful on those issues. A city attorney's office also can be involved in litigation, either for the administration or against the administration. So there was a lawsuit filed by the federal government against the state of California, and many local city attorneys and county attorneys filed briefs in support of the state, in support of our policies, saying we do not want to spend California's resources detaining or locking up our own residents to do the federal government's agenda, and we don't agree with that agenda either. And San Diego County was one that went the other way. And so the people that you elect to your county board of supervisors, the people you elect to be your city or county attorneys, they have a role in the positions that your municipality or your county takes on issues of immigration, which, again, if we do end up going further down this path at the federal level, then the local power and local resistance and recognizing those levels of citizenship, that the city, the county, the state can't do anything about what benefits the federal government, what privileges the federal government does and does not bestow on people. But there's no reason why your city can't treat someone with the same respect, with the same level of benefits and privileges, regardless of their national origin. Local law enforcement doesn't have to enforce and shouldn't be enforcing federal civil laws. And so I think really thinking about what kind of officials, and it really shouldn't be partisan, right? I mean, this should reflect a recognition of the value, that most of or many of the major corporations in this country have been founded by immigrant entrepreneurs. Certainly a large portion of our academic sector and our technical sector relies on the brightest people from all over the world choosing to come here and study, and then when they develop great ideas or come up with great research, putting that into practice. And so if you're a business-oriented person, you also can be sold on the value of embracing immigrants. And every scholar who doesn't want to come here because they don't want to deal with the visa process, or they don't want to find out that they're not allowed to land at the airport the day that their flight takes off because there's been some new presidential proclamation, every one of those people that this community loses, that any community loses, that's a resident of that community. That's a neighbor or a parent or a colleague or a teacher or a mentor. And I think a
vaccine creator.
Exactly. And we should get beyond partisan politics on this one. There are pieces of it that may be partisan for quite some time, but there are pieces of it that really are just human decency. So that, I think those are the local things, state and local things one can do, and, just raise these issues, especially populous communities. Our coastal areas or any place with a large urban population where there's likely to be more enforcement, your state and local government should be taking a stand on this. Also, if your community relies on agriculture, take a look in the mirror at who you are and what makes your community strong, and just own that and embrace it. And then
or at least
don't
be blatantly hypocritical and immoral. It's like you see someone.
I don't want to read any more articles about the small town that is sad that their favorite restaurant owner no longer lives in town, who never took the time to know that person enough to know that the policies they supported in theory or in the abstract affected someone they know personally. And I think, there's a broader conversation there about what it means to not talk about politics. I think immigration, much like the relationship that communities have with law enforcement, those of us who have never had to think about it in our personal lives may think, well, immigration is just a political issue. But there are people for whom that political issue is a necessary part of their day-to-day life. And, whether it's professionally or personally, it's the fact that people won't talk about these issues that they've cabined off as politics, I think, is part of the problem. And that's why a lot of state and local officials don't take stands on these things, because they can't change what the federal policy is directly. They can make it harder to implement. They can challenge its legality in court, and they can emphasize the effects that it has on real people. They can speak for the people they represent. And then, obviously, at the federal level, there are so many things. I mean, we talk about the executive because that's where most of this power is. But at the same time, there has been a lot going on in Congress to try to change various parts of this. And so I think when you're, if you're the kind of person who goes to congressional candidate forums or who communicates with people running for Senate, that you can ask, what are your positions about federal immigration policy? What kind of laws would you support? Do you support immigration reform? Do you support sort of a permanent implementation of what DACA was intending to achieve, which is some path to legal status and ideally citizenship for those who want it, for people who currently don't have such a path. And what other immigration reforms do people support? Ask those questions of candidates. Make them aware.
Where do you stand, homie?
That everybody cares. That it's not just radicals on both sides, but that ordinary American voters care the same way that they care about education or gun policy or taxes or anything else that the federal government does, that they care about immigration too, not just because it personally affects them or they have strong feelings about it, that they have human feelings about it. But then at the same time, if you see injustice in your community, it actually is Congress people and senators who can kind of step in those emergencies. Every senator's office, for example, has a sort of staff member whose job is to specifically address constituent calls that are relating to immigration issues. That's especially true in California, where we have such a large immigrant population. But if you live in New York or Florida or Texas or anywhere, if your senator's office doesn't have something like this, ask them why not. But there are things that those offices can do they have a more direct line to the agency to, pressure them to exercise discretion. And you've seen these things come up, the calls they get, the reports that they receive firsthand, those then make their way into hearings when there are congressional hearings on how the policies are being implemented or why decisions are getting made and what's being taken into consideration. And so don't be afraid to use your voice and communicate. If you or someone personally or care about in your community is being affected and you think there's something that your congressperson or senator might be able to do, or at the same time, if you just want to make them aware of something, if you say, every time I go to take my kids to school and I'm a citizen and my children are citizens, but I see Border Patrol in the neighborhood, why? And can you talk to them about this, because this doesn't seem good, and so that all of that is just ways that a person can address immigration issues. But then there are lots of different ways to also use your time or treasure to help. We've talked about a lot of different agencies. Both Grisel and I work for nonprofit organizations that are happy to accept anything that people are able to provide, and we're always grateful when people can support the work. There's also a lot of need for people to donate to funds that help pay for the liberation of people who have conditions set and just can't afford to meet them. So there are a lot of immigration bond funds, and I've given you some information about those that you can share. But anyone can look for immigration bond funds, and there are some that are regional that specifically free people from particular jails, and there are some that are national, where someone from anywhere in the United States who either has a client or a friend or a neighbor or family member locked in an immigration jail can ask that fund to help pay a bond once a bond has been set. And then there's so many different skills that people might have that can be helpful either to advocates or just volunteering directly with immigrants. And it does depend on where you live to some extent, but in this time where everything's happening remotely, it really depends on whether you want to use your professional skills to help or just language skills that you happen to have, or you just want to be a pen pal, you know?
I mean, even communication skills and art skills. I mean, I want to spotlight one project, which I think you're aware of. It's called In Plain Sight, which was an effort between artists and writers and a sky typing company to type messages over detention centers throughout the U.S., which kind of makes people aware that they're actually near a detention center, but also kind of provides a message for those who are incarcerated, those who are doing the incarcerating, and the kind of wider public to consider what is happening to these people under these systems. And that's a really innovative way for, if artists and sky typers can collaborate in a way that raises awareness and kind of draws attention to this issue, that anyone with any kind of communication skill or any kind of professional skill or kind of educational ability, I think can contribute. So I don't think it's people, I mean, both you and Grisel are attorneys, and obviously you're doing a lot of the kind of like on the ground work to kind of fight for people, but it's not just people with a legal background. I think anyone who kind of cares about other people and, you treat this as you treat any other kind of cause you care about. There's a way to get involved if you're motivated. So, I just wanted to put that out there too, because I think so many people think this is so overwhelming and so legal and so kind of hard to nudge that we'll just leave it to the lawyers and the advocates and the judges and the cops. It's like, no, everyone needs to play a role in this if you want it to change.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And I think just continuing to pay attention to what's happening, and just like any issue, read critically, look for the more personal stories that actually explain more than one perspective on these things. And yeah, anyone who wants to come to the border and see for themselves when that's a safe thing to do again, just let me know. But sure. Yeah, I think being aware and staying engaged, and this issue in this time, there are a few issues that really resonate the idea that, no one person is free until everyone is free, that each of our liberation is bound up together. This is one of those issues. I would say sort of immigration and human rights, as well as climate change, are those two. And I mean, the pandemic has brought this on us as well, that, there's disease everywhere. There's poverty everywhere. There's violence everywhere. And there's also, here in the United States, there's more than enough resources, more than enough land, more than enough kindness and time for everyone who needs it. And so, the only way that we can possibly say no is if we don't want to believe that. If we want to accept the people who tell us that there isn't enough, that it's dangerous to share, that it's dangerous to spread that wealth around, or to welcome people, or to give people help when they need it. Our history has shown the opposite. And so I think this issue at this time is really, really telling, at this time when we have the privilege of being in a really large country, but we're having this conversation while people in this very populous state we live in are being displaced by natural disaster and, having to flee their homes, not because of armed militias or violent, criminals or anything like that, but just because of nature. And I think if we can't start to see at this time, when people have relied so much on technology and charity and the resources the federal government or their state and local governments have to offer to keep people safe, keep people alive, keep people connected, if we can't recognize now how important it is for us to all see each other as fellow human beings first before we see each other as what we look like or where we come from or what kind of job skills we have, or, then it's the only way we're going to survive everything that the world has to throw at us.
And it's not done, so I think that that's a very kind of good note to end on, is that if we haven't seen what we need to see to kind of turn this around and understand that this is the only forward that will work for everyone, is to understand that we have more in common than we don't, and that this scarcity, fearful mindset is what limits us. It's not the actual reality of our resources. It's like how we choose to think about them. And the more we share and the more we welcome, actually, the more there is. And so I think that, if we don't if we haven't seen enough now, then I guess we deserve what comes. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I will post the resources that you sent to kind of send people your way and to Grisel's way. The one other thing I'll say, which I'll say until November, is another way to contribute is to vote. You do not, the one thing that we can all do in this country, at least those who kind of have the status to do so, is to make your voice heard, to vote for the people who support your values, who will kind of get behind the things that we're talking about today. And so I really hope that if you are watching this, you're someone who gets that already, but maybe you know a ton of people who are on the fence about that somehow, and please do what you can to make sure that those people understand the gravity of what is taking place here. So again, thank you so much for having.
People who aren't citizens can't vote. So if you don't care, find a person whether that's someone from the coffee shop or from the neighborhood or from your own family. But ask that person why the election is important to them, and use that to motivate you. Because, not everybody gets that privilege who lives in this country, who pays taxes, who contributes, who serves in the military, So, recognize that it is a privilege. It's not a right, and use it wisely.
Please. Well, keep up the good fight, Lauren. Thank you so much again. And thank you for tuning in to What We Gonna Do. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.